Hello, everyone. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Hannah Stewart, and I'm the director of the Counter-Extremism Group. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's event. It's an evening with Lord Carlile, former independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, and Dean Haydon, the former head of counter-terrorism policing, in conversation with Suzanne Raine, former head of the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre. This is the third annual public lecture from the Counter-Extremism Group, and it's really great to see so many friends and familiar faces. I'm also pleased to see people we don't know. It's great to see you as well. For those who don't know us, we're a small London-based think tank, and we specialise in counter-terrorism and counter-extremism research and policy advocacy. I'm really delighted to be joined by such impressive speakers tonight. They've worked for several decades in lawmaking, policing, foreign policy. They bring a wealth of experience on national security, counterterrorism and extremism, and they've confronted the difficult question of how to keep the public safe amid competing priorities. And as part of that, they've thought about how the systems they work in can best identify the ideologies and the people that seek to damage us. So it's a real pleasure to hear from them this evening. Our discussion is also a flagship event of our Young Leaders in National Security Fellowship, which is a residential course for young people who are interested in counter-terrorism and counter-extremism, and it's running all this week. Lord Carlile and Suzanne are kindly heading this year's programme, and with their support, we hope to help the fellows pursue careers in this area. So again, thank you so much for coming this evening. Thank you for braving the heat. And please join me in welcoming tonight's speakers.
Thank you, Hannah. Can you all hear me okay? Yep, great. Well, we've not got long. You've had a brief introduction. I'm not proposing to do a long introduction of Lord Carlile or Dean Haydon. You know Alex Carlile, I think, well already. Just to add a little bit on Dean, who might be less well known to you. Dean was in the police force for 35 years, and I knew him and worked with him when he was head of Counter-Terrorism Command SO15, a job which he did from 2015 to 2018, and we worked very closely then during particularly 2017 when we had a series of terrorist attacks in the UK. And then he went on to be Senior National Coordinator for Counter-Terrorism Policing from 2018 to 22. So who better, really, to lead us through this with Lord Carlile? I'm going to start by asking both of you a sort of broad question, and then we'll narrow it down and focus in on specific things. And actually, Dean, you and I were recently in a police conference in Las Vegas, where we heard an awful lot about the threat landscape becoming increasingly complex and diverse. And we heard an awful lot about definitions of different kinds of terrorism, international or domestic or ideologically or religiously or ethnically or racially motivated or right-wing or Islamist. And I kind of don't want us to have a conversation which says the threat landscape is becoming increasingly diverse and complex. But to hear from each of you what use all this conversation about definitions is, and for you on the question of extremism and terrorism, where you think we should be focusing at the moment. And I'm going to start with, who do you want me to start with? Shall I start with Alex? Do you want to start?
Okay, well, welcome to everyone. Where does one start with this? Well, I suppose I start with having been asked in 2007 by the then government to write a report on the definition of terrorism in UK law. And by then we had quite a complicated set of definitions, though not as complicated as they are now. And I thought, this is my great moment. I'm going to be able to recast the definition of terrorism in UK law. I'm going to produce something really dynamic and radical. So I made a few trips to other countries and read every single terrorism law in the world with the help of a researcher. and realized that an awful lot of countries had very good black letter terrorism laws. Pakistan, for example, at the time had a very clear, beautifully written terrorism law. So I went to Pakistan and I saw a group of judges there who tried terrorism cases, and I said to them, so how many terrorism cases have you done? And they'd all done 3 or 4 or more. And I said, put your hands up, those of you who've had convictions. And no hands went up, not one. There had not been a single conviction by that time in a terrorism case in Pakistan. And I said to them, well, why not? And they said, because we get presented with scientific evidence which we cannot admit in court, which was a bit of a puzzle to me. I said, you mean DNA evidence and fingerprints and things like that? Yes. And I said, why don't you admit it? And they said, because it's hearsay evidence. Well, you know, as a piece of Victorian purism, that might pass muster. But it was, of course, ridiculous. And I realized, actually, that it wasn't the black letter law that mattered. It was the way it was applied that was more important. And I think in the end, my report on the definition added 3 words to the existing definition of terrorism law. There's a better question, actually, Suzanne. Why do we need terrorism law at all? Because every single offence that Dean and his guys and gals have arrested people for and secured a conviction in could have been prosecuted as something else. Murder, using arms for various purposes. There's an offence to cover almost, now not quite everything, but almost everything. So why do we need terrorism law, and why do we need these definitions? Well, I think the answer is because terrorism, first of all, is quite difficult to investigate, particularly when you have solo actors who are being encouraged by what they're doing on the internet, so they're not part of a real physical network. And partly because it's terribly important, and the police, under Dean's guidance and the security services, have prevented a very large number of terrorism events in this country and saved a great number of lives. Detecting them early is really, really, really important. So we need a definition of terrorism law, mostly so that we can give the police powers to interdict actions which are going to lead to very serious terrorism offences. And I think that's much more important than the definition.
Thank you. Dean.
Yeah, thank you, Suzanne, and thank you for the invite for this evening. It's good to see so many people here, and actually some familiar faces, ex-colleagues, and also the current independent reviewer of terrorism as well, Jonathan Hall. So if you've got any really difficult questions, I'm going to look at Jonathan for obviously any answers. And also Tim Jakes, who took over my role after I retired, so the current Senior National Coordinator of counter-terrorism. I suppose if I come back to your question then, Suzanne, around why are definitions important?
Not just that, but what do you think of? So not just why is it important, but when you're thinking about it, when you were approaching what was useful to you?
So I was going to touch on, I suppose, two areas really, extremism and terrorism. So they're both quite complex, they're complicated, and particularly for policing, I think having definitions from legislators and Parliament is extremely useful, because it does, as Lord Carlile has just said, it opens up additional powers for us. It opens up a kind of box, if you like, for policing around detention powers, cordon powers, and a whole host of intrusive techniques that we wouldn't necessarily use in kind of mainstream policing. So when I look at a terrorist investigation, I'll come back to extremism in a minute, but when I look at a terrorist investigation, we're quite often talking about evidence that comes from overseas, internationally. There's a fair amount of material that's online, whether in fact it's propaganda or radicalisation material or instructional material. There's probably financing issues. And as a result of that, if I take a mainstream policing investigation, let's call crime, serious and organised crime, quite often we need additional time to detain an individual to fully understand the extent of the evidence against an individual and whether in fact they pose a real risk to public safety. And that's the overarching aim around any terrorist investigation. Is there a threat to public safety? So if I come back to extremism is a bit of a sliding scale, if you like, for us. So if you take extremism almost to the kind of left-hand side, you've got public order and protest. So you'll have groups like environmental groups. I'm not saying they're extremists, but you'll have public order and protest groups on that kind of side of the scale, all the way up to violent extremism. And there is no kind of linear line that a person starts at one end and ends up in the other, because quite rightly, somebody in relation to public order and protest will probably continue public order and protest. There's very few that end up at the other end of the scale. But from a policing point of view, as in counter-terrorism, we focus with our partners like MI5 and MI6, we focus on the violent extremism end. So those that pose, or likely to pose, a real risk to public safety. And then there's the terrorism, if you flip to the kind of extreme end, there's then the terrorism element. So somebody who wants to attack us, do us harm, and impact on all of us for public safety and national security issues. And like I say, having a definition, particularly for terrorism, is extremely useful for me, and now Tim. Really from the point of view of my previous role, and now Tim, we were the only police officers in the country that could ultimately declare an incident as a terrorist incident. So using the kind of definition under TACT. And that's really important because there's a number of factors we have to take into account. We have to look at the intelligence, we have to look at the law, there's a fair amount of professional judgment in there. And as a result, you've got one decision maker for the whole country. So wherever it happens, anywhere in the country, anywhere, England, Wales, Scotland, not necessarily in Northern Ireland, it's a slightly different case. But you've got one decision maker making the decision around this is now declared as a terrorist incident. And the reason for that then is you've got consistency. It's quite often a really difficult decision. Some of them are pretty obvious. So if you take the Manchester attack, for instance, Salman Abedi who detonated a suicide bomb there, pretty obvious that's going to be a terrorist attack. But there's quite a few that are in the kind of grey space. So that then comes back to the professional judgment. And once it's declared, it then opens up like almost that kind of Pandora's box, if you like, of additional powers like detention, like cordons, like further investigative powers that mainstream policing doesn't have. And I think that's really important for our investigators to then get under the skin around, is there a real threat to national security and is there a real threat to public safety?
Can I stay with you, Dean, for a moment, and then I'll come to Lord Carlile. I'll come to you in a minute. So let's talk about the complex threat landscape that we're facing now. So I think, you correct me if I'm wrong, that in the UK, it's still approximately 75% of cases are Islamist terrorism, with the vast majority of the remaining ones being extreme right, far right ring terrorism. What's the difference in terms of how they operate, how they recruit and radicalise, and the kinds of threat that these two broadly defined different types of domestic terrorism in the UK at the moment?
So if we start with Islamist terrorism, so if you look back over the past number of years, if you look at all the attacks that have happened in the UK, I suppose at any one time there's about 900 investigations. That number is pretty consistent really over the past kind of decade or so. But the vast majority, as I said, 75% are Islamist related, and a lot of the attacks we've seen in the UK have been Islamist inspired. Again, that threat's slightly changed. So, if I was talking probably 5 or 10 years ago, and even when you were, in your role, Suzanne, the threat from Islamist terrorism was directed from overseas. So, if you take the big events of, let's say, 9/11, 7/7, those type of incidents, mostly kind of directed, and we saw other events as well, mostly directed from overseas. That's now changed slightly, and what we're now seeing is it's more inspired from overseas. So events that take place overseas, And if you look at the attacks that have happened in the past couple of years, probably well over 80% of the people that have gone on to commit an attack have been British nationals, people that actually live here in this country. So it's now inspired, the kind of acts are inspired by events that are taking place overseas. But Suzanne's right, now 25% of our casework is now extreme right-wing and something that's called LACIT, so left, anarchist, and single-issue terrorism, which we can go into if you want in a minute. But that's the other part of our casework. And that changed probably back in, I think it was about 2018. So if you look at the 5 attacks that we had in this country in 2017, so if you start with Westminster, London Bridge, Manchester, Finsbury Park Mosque, and then ultimately the bomb that was left on the tube at Parsons Green. 5 attacks in 1 year. That then resulted in David Anderson, who was also a previous kind of independent reviewer of terrorism. The government and the head of MI5 and the Met Police brought in David Anderson, or asked David Anderson, through the Home Secretary, to do an independent review of those 5 attacks. And the reason for that is we were concerned, those 5 attacks, are they connected in any way? Could we have been better as a kind of community? So what I mean by that is counter-terrorism, policing, MI5, MI6, GCHQ, the military, government, etc., etc. Could we have been better in relation to identifying those attacks and ultimately preventing them? Interestingly, when you talk about the 5 attacks, and I can go into this in more detail if you want in a minute, but when you look at those 5 attacks, every single one of them is different. They're not connected in any way. So the head-scratching moment for us that year was, why have we suddenly had 5 attacks in 1 year? Highly unusual. I think it was 35 people ultimately died that year, horrendous. So a real demand on the system. So we wanted to understand through David Anderson, could we have been better as a community? And as a result, he did a really intrusive review around all of our systems and processes and made well over 100 recommendations. And one of those key recommendations was that at that stage, extreme right-wing terrorism was ultimately led and investigated by the police, not by MI5. MI5 mainly focused on Islamist terrorism. But one of the key recommendations was that MI5 should now take primacy for extreme right-wing violent terrorism as well. And that then changed the landscape. So that's why we're now dealing with about 25% of extreme right-wing cases. Because when you think about it logically, and we don't fully understand the kind of implications as yet, it's still early days, even though it's been a couple of years. But as soon as you lift a stone on an extreme right-wing case, you then find somebody else, you find an associate, you find a network. And when we started this in about 2018, I think the casework at that stage was about 12, 14, 15%. We're now at 25%. Okay, and that's because we're lifting the stone and finding more. We're finding the connections and we're finding people are concerned, not just in this country, but overseas as well. So it's an interesting landscape, and I think that dynamic will change in the years to come as well.
Thanks, Dean. Lord Carlile, we're talking there about the police action. Clearly, there's a much broader sort of set of government departments which engage with the public, which engage with people who are vulnerable to radicalisation. So where do you think the boundaries should be between police activity, activity of other parts of the state, and then other forms of intervention? How do you see, and where does prevent fit into all of that?
Okay, I thought it wouldn't take long to get to prevent. Anyway, I think my starting comment would be about what Dean has just said. When you hear the raw numbers, 25% of cases being right-wing extremism, that's not an assessment of seriousness or risk. So what the authorities have to do, and commentators are often rather negligent about this, is assess where the real risks to the public are. And the reality is that certainly up to now, most of the really serious risks, there are exceptions, this is a sweeping generalization, but most of the really serious risk has come from Islamist terrorism. And certainly the international Islamist terrorists, but it does apply to some extent to those who go solo from home because they're usually connected electronically with others around the world who give them their motivation. They are, on the whole, more sophisticated intellectually than right-wing extremists, I would say. Right, and this is a bit of a mirror image of the sort of terrorism there used to be in Northern Ireland, where the nationalists on the whole were rather more sophisticated than the loyalists, as they were called, who were in general terms old-fashioned hoodlums who one would recognize in any courtroom as committing various kinds of assorted crime. So that's the first thing. We have to make a proper assessment of risk and not be driven by negligent commentators into a corner in which it is said, well, because 25 or 30% of terrorist actors are right-wing extremists, therefore 25% of effort should go into them. So that brings us to the question of who does what. Well, I think the police play an excellent part in this. They've got a very good record, and they are a model for reorganisation of the police forces in this country. We have got 43 territorial police forces in England and Wales. It is an absolute nonsense. It's not a way in which a police force should be organised. We have how many CTUs?
5.
5 now.
So we've got 5 CTUs that sit above those 43 police forces, and they are dedicated, mostly detectives. There's about 8,000 detective staff that sit under the leadership and command of, well, it was me, but now Tim over here. And they work jointly with MI5 and the security services, focusing full-time on counter-terrorism operations. So those 5 CTUs, counter-terrorism units, they are located around the country. Scotland separate, Northern Ireland separate as well. And from their perspective, like I say, they're run kind of overseen from London, but they feed off from a kind of staffing point of view, they feed off those 43 police forces. Yeah. So if I just take an example, let's say, for instance, Manchester. So we have got a CTU in Manchester. They feed off all the forces in Manchester. So you've got Manchester, Liverpool, and the kind of neighbouring forces. So the local police are therefore part of the CTU, so they know the communities, they have the connections, but they are ultimately focused full-time on counter-terrorism operations.
But the structuring of counter-terrorism units, and I think there used to be 11 at one time, and the number has been reduced, but they are a model for the way in which the police forces should be reorganised in this country. And I think we would have a much more efficient service. So CTU policing has been very successful in its organisation. MI6, of course, deal with foreign issues. They don't deal with domestic issues directly, though they provide a great deal of information. I'm sure you would agree, Dean, that MI5 play an extremely important part in counter-terrorism policing, and indeed the way in which information is coordinated, which is done by JTAC, which Suzanne used to run, which brings together all the information from a whole range of sources, is also extremely important in doing all this. So I think we've got the structures for counter-terrorism broadly right. Now, we next come to Dean's distinction, correct distinction, between terrorism and radicalisation. We're a democratic country. We have certain principles that we swear by rightly. So you're allowed to think what you like. You can think like a terrorist and you're not doing anything wrong at all. You can wake up in the morning and wish that you could commit a terrorism offence and you're doing nothing wrong at all. It's bad judgment, but you're not committing a crime. And there's a whole gradation of things that can happen or not happen between thinking, talking to other people, inciting or assisting, and committing a crime. Prevent, which is one of the 4 parts of counter-terrorism policy, is designed to do exactly what it says on the tin. Prevent people from becoming terrorists. I and then William Shawcross completed the job. He really did the job, I just started it. Reviewed Prevent in considerable detail, taking evidence from all around the country. Prevent has been successful in the sense that it has reformed the lives of many people who were referred by, for example, school teachers. Secondary school teachers in particular have cooperated extremely well with Prevent and produced correct results. However, of course, our friends in the media, and I love the media, so please don't think I'm criticizing them as a class, but if they find that there's a case in which a word in an essay has been misunderstood and they report someone to Prevent, then of course they're castigated for dragging some poor 13-year-old girl into Prevent. I'm bound to say to those journalists that they don't make the same fuss about people who've been arrested and not prosecuted, of whom there are a huge number every year. So again, we have to keep a sense of balance. When people are referred to Prevent, they go through a process which is called channel panels, in which every case is brought before a rather too large professional group to assess whether they should be put into the Prevent process. Channel panels, as William Shawcross said, need to be reformed, and that will happen. The government has accepted those recommendations. But once they're into Prevent, then they are out of the hands of the police. The police, in my view, should have, and mostly do have, no part in the everyday running of Prevent. If during the programs that are prepared for the individuals, it transpires that they're still determined, full of terrorism ideation, of course the police should be brought back in. But the success of Prevent has been quite high. It's been lampooned, castigated, and criticized. When we started the Prevent review, we were told Prevent should go. There are some brilliant academics and some frankly dreadful academics who started their work on Prevent with a prejudice and in fact are more campaigners than academics. I had a review done by a body in Cabinet Office of all the academic literature on Prevent, and it was a qualitative judgment because it's not possible to judge these things quantitatively, but the qualitative judgment was 25% of it was worth reading and the other 75% was not really worth taking any trouble over. But with good commentators and with a fair wind for Prevent, then we will get results like I'm about to illustrate. I went to a city in the north and I met, as Prevent reviewer at the time, three Muslim men who were doing Prevent schemes in their city. One of them had a relatively easy scheme because he was picking out the good footballers and taking them to the local well-known professional football club where they were training, and one or two of them had the possibility maybe to become professional footballers of one kind or another. So they were easy to distract. The others were doing much more complicated schemes. And I said to them, so Prevent is toxic. Everybody's telling me Prevent is toxic. That was the word that a lot of NGOs were using. And they said, no, it's not toxic. So I said, well, what do you say to your communities? You live in Muslim communities in your city. What do you say? And they replied, we tell them we're doing what's on the tin. We tell them we're preventing their sons, brothers, they're mostly male, sons, brothers, fathers, from becoming terrorists. And people accept that, and we don't get any trouble within our own communities once we explain what we've been doing. And in my view, Prevent has done a very good job. Of course, like every government-funded scheme, it's well capable of improvement, and William Shawcross has suggested some very good improvements. But I hope that Prevent will remain, under its name, because its name means something, a quarter part of our counter-terrorism activity.
Dean.
I mean, I'm a massive fan of Prevent, so coming back to Lord Carlile's point around the government strategy, you'll probably be well aware that there are 4 parts to it. We call it the 4 Ps, so Prevent being the first one. around identifying the kind of root causes of radicalisation, secondly, safeguarding, and then thirdly, kind of diversion and rehabilitation. Second one then is pursue. So that's kind of going after the bad guys. That's where kind of I come in, if you like, around arrest and prosecution, so mostly for policing and law enforcement. The third one is protect. Protect is all about kind of target hardening venues, iconic locations, to make it less susceptible to a terrorist to actually commit an attack. And the last one is prepare, which is kind of testing and exercising. So do we know what to do when an event happens? And my previous boss and even currently within counter-terrorism policing, we often say prevent is the most important one of those P's. And rather interestingly, when you go internationally, when you start looking at kind of systems overseas, those countries look at us with a bit of envy because a lot of those countries don't have a prevent kind of strategy whatsoever. And of course, the reason from my point of view to say it's probably the most important is because I would rather somebody who is of concern, so family, friends who look at one of their loved ones who may be going off the rails slightly and potentially becoming an extremist or a violent extremist or a terrorist, ultimately a kind of a terrorist, which is where the public safety element comes in. It's far better to intervene early. It's far better to give them support, rehabilitate them and divert them, ultimately with a view to not just saving their life, but saving multiple lives, as opposed to the pursue element of almost kind of arrest and prosecution now, and all of not just the cost that involves, but you're now incarcerating an individual, taking away somebody's liberty, and potentially, a terrorist, as we've seen often through the courts because the sentencing powers are different as well, getting almost kind of life imprisonment. So coming back to all of those kind of 4 Ps, it's far better to intervene early, to divert somebody, support somebody, safeguard somebody and rehabilitate somebody. And that's why we often say prevent is the most important pillar. I would hate to see it change its title. I would hate to see it go. With all the political pressure, I know William Shawcross has obviously done his recent review, but it's really important for us in policing. And again, there's teams in this room that are part of the kind of prevent lead nationally that again we can pick up afterwards if you've got any further questions around prevent.
Yeah, and I suppose I'd reflect, especially having worked on terrorism in government and counter-terrorism and left, that absolute clarity of a strategy with 4 Ps gives to every part of the system. So if you want to talk about risk management and who owns the risk and where, the model of how the UK organises its counter-terrorism effort is one that I think you could apply to anything. You could apply it to, building structure in schools. You could apply, it's just everybody knows what their job is, and there's absolute clarity over what your role is in the process. And it comes from that really simple strategy at the top that was designed 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago now.
You may know the answer to this, Suzanne. Is it true that the 4 Ps were thought up by Sir David Omand in the shower?
He definitely claims he thought them up. I don't know where that happened. I wouldn't begin to say. Dean, I want to ask you a really sort of a practical question about policing, because what we know is that the threat landscape is becoming more diverse and more complex, and new forms of extremism and terrorism are not replacing old forms, they're coming on top of them. So the challenge for you, which for you before you left and now for Tim, is how on earth you prioritise all of that. And I'm not asking you to explain everything, but what are some of the thought processes that you go through? And are there pieces of information that are particularly helpful or particularly unhelpful as you're going through that process, as you're trying to work out where you put the effort and where you don't, knowing that every time you get it wrong, you're going to be blamed for getting it wrong and have to go through years of inquests and inquiries as to how that decision was wrong?
Yeah, it's a complex system, really complex system, and I suppose it ultimately comes back to there's only so many resources to go around. So what I mean by that, there's only so many surveillance teams across the country, there's only so many armed police officers across the country, there's only there's only so many investigators, whether in fact they sit in MI5, the security services, or whether in fact they sit in counter-terrorism policing. So we have to have a pretty robust prioritisation process jointly, and when I say jointly, that's between mostly counter-terrorism policing and the security services. So there is a weekly meeting that takes place that looks at all of that prioritisation process. It looks at all the intelligence, it looks at individuals, it looks at groups, it looks at the threat that they pose. And ultimately, like I say, the overarching aim with anything we do is public safety and the threat they may pose to public safety. And as a result of that, on a weekly basis, we prioritise, a bit like a football league, if you like. We prioritise all those operations. And as I said earlier on, in any kind of given week, there's probably about 800 live investigations that are taking place at any one time. Some of them slow time. If you get down to the bottom of that football league, some of them are slow time and they're ticking over and there's not much happening with them. Others, we'll have surveillance and armed surveillance, and we'll have people out on the ground looking and actively monitoring individuals to make sure they don't pose a threat to public safety. And like I say, that's done jointly with the security services. So when I come back to almost those 4 Ps that I mentioned earlier on around almost the kind of international envy, the other international envy is how we operate as a system here. So what I mean by that is how closely counter-terrorism police work with our security services. Because I can guarantee if you go to a lot of other countries, they're very much separate. The police and security services, intelligence agencies, don't even talk to each other, let alone sit in the same room. Some do, but some don't. The vast majority don't. Whereas here, coming back to that weekly prioritisation process, we're sat in the same room together, we've got investigators working jointly together, we prioritise together, and then ultimately, if we're going to take executive actions, what I mean by that is we're going to arrest, we're going to prosecute, we're going to search people's houses. That decision is ultimately taken by the police, because then it flips from the security services primacy into policing. So there's a real challenge around security services, mostly focused on intelligence. So if I look at 2 buckets, if you like, you've got intelligence, that's their remit from a legal statutory perspective, and then policing is evidence. Okay, and the challenge that we often have is how you convert some of that intelligence into evidence. And when we have sufficient evidence, or there's a real public safety element that's at the forefront, then the police will take action. So it's a challenging, complex decision that is taking place almost every single day, every minute, but we will prioritise on a weekly basis around where we're going to put our assets, depending on risk and threat.
I've got 2 final questions, but we've also going to leave at least half an hour for you guys to ask questions. So what I'm going to do is put my 2 questions out, and you can answer either of them or neither of them, depending.
Depends how difficult.
Well, I don't know.
It sounds like that.
I think they're quite difficult. But so the first is whether and to what extent the pandemic has changed this problem, because it's changed the problem in so many other ways, and we've seen, rise of mental health issues, difficulties with young people settling and things, and has that led to an increase in extremism? And then the second question...
That's an easy one, I can answer.
Okay, yep. What's the answer?
No, go on.
No, go ahead, answer.
So pandemic, it was interesting actually. So, if you think of the worst stage of the pandemic, when we were in complete and utter lockdown, so people ultimately not allowed outside their house. That changed the dynamic of our investigations as well. So coming back to what I just said earlier on around surveillance and armed assets and investigators out on the ground and what have you. Of course, if one of our subjects of interest, somebody that we're looking at, is not allowed outside their house, for the next 6 months or a year, we're quite clearly not going to put a surveillance team outside their house or down their street, because they're going to stand out like a sore thumb, aren't they? They're the only people out on foot or in a car or in a bush or whatever they do. They're going to stand out like a sore thumb because they're the only people out on the street. And what we saw, the kind of knock-on effect of that, the impact, was that a lot of the people that we were investigating, because again, they weren't allowed outside the house, what they actually did was they went online. So they were looking at propaganda material, they were radicalising, self-radicalising, they were sharing material. And it changed how we, if you come back to Lord Carlile's issues around prevent and some of the other work that we do, again, if I was doing this talk a few years ago, prior to the pandemic, we would look at a subject of interest around, let's say, their ideology or their affiliation. So let's say you got people connected to Al-Qaeda. What we generally found pre-pandemic is that Al-Qaeda individuals consumed mostly Al-Qaeda propaganda and material. So Al-Qaeda were releasing online material and magazines and so on and so forth. So they were kind of stovepiped in relation to generally looking at their own material. Daesh, ISIS, ISIL, whatever you want to call them, ISIS, they again were stovepiped in relation to consuming their material. And extreme right wing were completely different, consuming their material. And what the pandemic did, it changed all of that kind of fundamentally, because what we now see through our prevent teams and prevent referrals is something we now call mixed ideology. So people experimenting, particularly youngsters, experimenting and looking across the whole spectrum of all of that material. So consuming as much violent material, extremist material, terrorism material as they can. And it doesn't matter whether, in fact, you're affiliated to Al-Qaeda, ISIS, or extreme right wing. You're going to look at everything. People just consuming as much as they can. So it changed a lot of the investigations. And even during the kind of lockdown, we saw, I think, off the top of my head, I think we saw 3 terrorist attacks. I'm going back now in history. I think we saw 3 terrorist attacks, people still actively planning, that we ultimately arrested and then prosecuted. So it didn't stop people planning, people still continued, but it lowered the kind of levels of our casework. And then when the pandemic finished and people started coming out and about again, what we then saw is actually a rise in the threat, because we now saw people that had consumed all of that material, been self-radicalized, looked at a lot of propaganda and instructional material, and our casework actually elevated. So it did change fundamentally how we operate. It changed our subjects of interest, because they now went online, they weren't out and about, and they weren't actively doing hostile reconnaissance or looking at, whatever venue. I'm not going to name any venue because I'll jinx something. But it changed how they operated, and it changed how we operated as well.
That's really interesting. I think there's going to be some studies done, I think, over the next 5 years, I predict, into behavioural change that came out of the pandemic. It's a really interesting angle. So, Lord Carlile, I'm afraid you get the second one, which is, should we worry about what's happening overseas, in Afghanistan, in Syria and Iraq, particularly in North Africa at the moment? Because we worried about that enormously as being the centre from which the threat was projected back towards us. We, the Americans, have now left all those countries. Does that make us safer or less safe? I'm sorry, that's a massive question, so you don't have to answer all of that, but should we worry?
We do worry about what happens overseas. As you know, it's absolutely essential that we do. And, this is an important part of the work done by, for example, MI6, but not exclusively MI6. What is happening in Afghanistan at the present time is very worrying. It's not just the optics of the way in which women are not being educated, for example, but it is the fact that although the Taliban are very much opposed to some terrorism because it could affect them, there are terrorist cells in Afghanistan. We should be very concerned about the political situation in Pakistan. Pakistan has always been a risk area for increasing terrorism. The number of unregistered in madrasas in Pakistan is huge, and they are, some of them, risky places. We should keep an eye on what is happening among the growing right-wing parties in Europe, in Hungary, in Poland, in France, in Germany, and to some extent here, because we can predict, if we keep an eye on those developments, terrorism events which may occur here and prevent them.
Thank you very much. Right, it's your turn now. I think, who's got the microphone? Catherine's got the microphone. And Hannah. So please put your hand up. There's lots of the fellows who've got questions. Great.
And do you want to announce yourself before you ask your question? I'm Eleanor. I'm one of the fellows. You say since the pandemic, you've seen a rise in mixed ideologies, and after the pandemic now, there's a rise in threat. Obviously, you still have these mixed ideologies going around. I was wondering if you continue to see it rising, or now the pandemic's over, it's sort of reached it's leveling out.
So bearing in mind I left last year, so I might have to look at some of my teams over there. But again, I'll take a kind of stab in the dark on this one. So the reason we saw mixed ideology is because of some of the issues I've already explained. And part of the challenge we have also now is that we also change our tactics slightly as well, is that we tend to intervene a lot earlier. So whether in fact it's on prevent or on the pursue kind of side. And as a result of that, we just don't know. So people consuming lots of this kind of material. So I often call it like, particularly for youngsters, living in the kind of Xbox world. So I probably should say there are other consoles on the market, so I don't get myself in trouble. But living in that kind of Xbox world of people, particularly youngsters, as they're going through their kind of teenage life, reaching out, experimenting with the world, trying to find their way in life. We see lots of youngsters, including, my son and daughter as well, lots of these kind of war games and shooting each other and kind of, you could say, bordering on kind of violent, well, definitely bordering on violence. I'm not suggesting for one moment that those people then become an extremist or a terrorist, but some do. And as a result, some people will move onto online and look at propaganda material, extremist material, and all the stuff that I said previously. And because we're intervening early, we just don't know, coming back to those kind of bucket stovepipes of people, are you Al-Qaeda, are you ISIS, are you extreme right-wing, and there's kind of others out there as well, that people are consuming everything, and we just don't know where their kind of mindset is, some of them. So are they really an extreme right-wing individual, or are they really Al-Qaeda? So intervening early, we got more investigations in that space, particularly in extreme right-wing, and therefore mixed ideology, I think we will see continue to rise. So I'll look over there. Would I be right or not? So I'm getting a nod of the head. She's not going to challenge me, but we're getting a nod of the head. But we can probably pick that up afterwards. I'll point you to the kind of prevent teams over there. But that would be my view of kind of when I left, around, I think it's still on the increase.
Can I add something? Because I was, as I mentioned earlier, in Las Vegas with Tim and Dean. And one of the things that came across really vividly, particularly actually, it was a conference of the Anglophone policing community, and hearing particularly the Australians, the Canadians, and the US police talking about an Anglophone radicalization problem in a way, and the sovereign citizen movement and things like that, which is flipping from truckers in Canada to Christian fundamentalists in America to people in Australia, really interesting sort of crossovers between, and there was a statistic that came out halfway through where one of the US police said, this was June, so far in the US this year, we've had more mass shootings than we've had days. And so that level of ambient mass casualty violence in America is also then on this Anglophone internet, which I think was, for me, it was a sign of something that's really changing.
Thank you for the question, Eleanor. During lockdown, there moved into our house two much-loved adult daughters and an elderly grandmother. And I think lockdown was a very tense period in most houses, however much we all loved each other. And it was a common experience. And for those who suffered particularly boredom, isolation, unaddressed certain forms of neurodiversity, and lack of home stability, it was inevitable that there would be a great deal of frustration, and people were looking for something to do, and where were they going to find it? On the internet. And it is statistically correct that there was a significant quantum increase in radical material on the internet during lockdown worldwide, including in the Middle East and Asia. And the next bit is human nature. How do people behave after that kind of experience? Well, most of them go back with relief to their normal daily lives, to school, to college, to work, but some don't. And you are inevitably going to get the increased cohort of people who are at least wanting to commit terrorist offences, because it's all they've been thinking about. It seems like something worth doing in what has been for them an intensely boring world. And it was one of the, I'm looking forward to the study you referred to. Because,
someone out here can do it.
Suzanne, because I think we do not yet understand what the effect of lockdown was, particularly on people between the age of, say, 10 and 25.
I think what we also saw, the final part to that is, going back to lockdown, all the kind of support mechanisms for particularly vulnerable individuals all disappeared as well. So if you look at some of the kind of statutory support around social services, mental health, because again, equally, they were on lockdown. They were not coming out visiting people. People were not going in to visit them in the various kind of centres that provide the support. So all of that statutory support decreased. But then also there was decrease in relation to family, peers and friends, because people were just not seeing their normal group of kind of peers. And some people completely isolated, vulnerable sections of the community, mental health issues. It became a lot worse under lockdown than it was before.
Sorry, are you who's choosing? There's so many, yeah.
Hello, I'm Roha and I'm one of the fellows. This time last year I was in Pakistan and I was assessing their CVE policies. And just in regards to the strengths of Prevent, would you say that one of the core strengths that we're seeing in maybe Prevent and not other CVE initiatives taken in other countries is the kind of stakeholder, local bureaucrats, police kind of engagement across society that maybe other countries aren't getting? And that's why it's not as stronger there?
That's a really interesting question. During the Obama administration, sent a very highly respected American academic to work in the United States Embassy in London. And specifically, he was asked to look at Prevent and other counter-radicalisation measures. And he did a lot of work with Waltham Forest London Borough Council, which had quite a sophisticated set of Prevent activities going on, and I attended them on a few occasions. And the professor went back to the United States, very keen to develop a Prevent strand of US counter-terrorism policy. And after about 6 months, he went back to his university in California to carry on with his academic life, because the American government system doesn't permit national schemes like that to be developed, because America is highly, highly devolved into states. Now, we have a form of devolution, and Prevent is completely different in Scotland in many ways from England and Wales. It's not so different in Wales. And I think that the involvement of less devolved authorities is useful for Prevent. However, we have had a problem with the involvement of local authorities. Prevent co-ordinators, as they're called, who are professional, highly qualified professional people with a great deal of knowledge about Prevent and who have the responsibility of making it work, are up to now employed by local authorities. On one occasion, I was asked to meet 12 Prevent officers in a room in Birmingham, so they were from that sort of region. And the Birmingham Prevent scheme was actually very, very effective on the whole, despite some problems in schools. There was a very articulate Prevent officer, Prevent coordinator from another large locality in the region. And I listened to him with great care, and I said, "You were really interesting, but as the Prevent coordinator, you coordinate anyone other than yourself." And he said to me, "You've hit the nail on the head, because local authorities have funding issues about Prevent. They have to pay for some of it, not all of it, and some of them are more reluctant or feel they don't need to pay for it than others. So that, for example, in Leicester, and I think somebody who was involved in Leicester Prevent was in this room earlier but has left, But in Leicester, the elected mayor of Leicester did not want Leicester City Council to be involved in Prevent. So they subcontracted it to what was originally a Church of England charity, an independent NGO who did a magnificent job in Leicester with Prevent. It really worked terribly well. So the point I'm making in answer to your question, Roa, is that the structure needs to be right for every region. You don't want the variations of a very good privately run system by an NGO in Leicester, a very good publicly run system in Birmingham, and a system that's not run at all in another city, which I will not name, where that Prevent coordinator, who was very articulate, was. So I think one of the beneficial results of Shawcross will be that Prevent will be standardized around the country. Prevent coordinators will be more professionalized, more collegiate, and that they will be more like a structure of people who are like, say, health and safety inspectors who go where they're needed and can turn to one another for support when and where it's needed, because you never know where terrorist incidents are going to occur. It's complicated, but it's a good question.
Okay, we've got so many questions, it's really hard to...
So Alex has got a microphone already.
Great.
Thank you very much, very interesting. My question's very simple. If you were king for a day, what is the first change you would make to the CT apparatus? What I'm asking is, where is the biggest fire? What is the biggest structural problem that the British CVE CT apparatus has?
Interesting one.
Over to you.
If I was king for the day, was it? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Wow, what would I change? Interesting one.
Well, is it worth talking about CTOC? Because in that sense, there's a process, there's a big change happening, isn't there?
Yeah, so Suzanne mentioned CTOC, so that's a counter-terrorism operations centre. So coming back to what I said earlier on around the 2017 attacks, the 5 that we had in 2017, and David Anderson's review, one of the fundamental kind of recommendations in there is that all the agencies could be closer. And what was quite often described at various kind of coroners' courts and public inquiries is that could we have been better at joining the dots? Okay, so whether in fact you've got counter-terrorism policing over here, whether in fact you've got MI5 over here, MI6, GCHQ and others. We all work closely together, but one of those recommendations is we could have been closer. So one of the recommendations was to create something that's called CTOC. It's a building in West London where all of us now are going to come together. So MI5, MI6, GCHQ and counter-terrorism policing. And when we have one of those kind of 800 live investigations that I've been talking about, so the Football League, actually we're all sat in the kind of same room as the principal, and we're all working jointly as investigators on one particular job. We're sharing information. There's some challenges with that. I'm not going to say it's easy. There's some cultural challenges with kind of the different agencies coming together. You've got some legal challenges, particularly around disclosure. But there's an appetite to do it based on we could do better, we could join the dots better. So that's a great prompt from Suzanne to answer that question around what would I change? We could probably do it quicker, but you've got to bear in mind it's a kind of refurbishment of a building that's still probably a year or so away. I mean, the teams are moving in, but it's still probably a year or so away in relation to being finalised. If I come back to what I said earlier on around a kind of more general kind of view about the counter-terrorism machine here, I think it's really good. And again, when you look internationally, of course it could be better. And CTOC is one of those things that we're looking at. But when I look internationally around how counter-terrorism effort is often worked overseas, the relationship we have between all those parties that are charged with keeping the public safe, I think we do a pretty good job. Like I say, not being complacent, of course we could be better, but actually in comparison, I think we're pretty close. We are collaborative, and I've spoken about the attacks that have happened. What I haven't spoken about is the amount of attacks we've actually disrupted and prevented. I'm not sure what the current figure is, but it's about 40. I think not just far off 40. since 2017. So that's 40 attacks that if they'd got through, further atrocities would have happened. Some of that is celebrated openly through the courts with people getting convicted. Some of it is never spoken about. And that is the kind of value of that counter-terrorism machine that operates fundamentally, behind the scenes ultimately, but is trying to keep people safe.
That's one of the paradoxes as well, because if you're really good at your job, then you stop the attacks and they don't happen. And then people say, well, terrorism's reducing, and therefore we've got so many other things we need to worry about, so we'll take away the funding for terrorism, we'll put it on something that's more of a problem. And this is what I've called the snooze, panic, snooze cycle. So the funding only really comes when things get really bad, and then you surge resources there until everything's good and you're on top of the problem, and then you take it away again. So the real concern that I would have is it's really, really difficult if you've done the job well, and so you've disrupted 40 attacks, whatever, then it's really difficult for the politicians to think, well, I need to give them more money, because what they see is less of a problem. Sorry, I'm... Yeah.
Hello, Kafai Hussain, Prevent Manager from East London. Going back to the definition debate, with the Wagner Group now being labelled a terrorist organisation, is there a danger of mission creep and all organisations that oppose British interests anywhere in the world being labelled terrorists regardless of whether or not they fit any kind of definition, especially when, as you've said, the definition remains abstract and fluid? And in doing that, don't we discredit the whole CT legal and operational infrastructure?
It's about the Wagner Group. So the Wagner Group's been prescribed as a terrorist organisation, and does that kind of prescription of violent political entities overseas end up undermining?
Okay, that's an important question. Proscription of organisations is a blunt instrument, and I've always had reservations about political demands to proscribe any organisation unless there was a solid counter-terrorism basis for doing so, like banning would reduce the number of people involved in the organisation or would help to obtain evidence in some way. The history of proscription is not particularly good. There is something called POAC, the Proscribed Organisations Appeals Commission. There have been very, very few successful appeals to POAC. It took one Sikh youth movement many years to be removed from the list of proscribed bodies. It took an Iranian civil liberties organisation, which is based in France, but has activists who are often to be seen around Parliament, around this part of London, many years to be removed from the list of proscribed organisations, and it was a mistake to leave them on the list for so long. Another criticism is that certainly in the Irish context, and there's quite a number of Irish organisations which are still proscribed, it's arguable that some of them barely exist anymore, and they don't apply to be removed, maybe because there aren't enough people to bother to apply. So I think we have to be more careful about it. I think, however, the proscription of the Wagner Group is justified. My belief is that the Wagner Group is just the sort of group that would attract people who might otherwise not become involved in terrorism, who would think they were going to do something very exciting by coming involved in the Wagner Group with all the optics that we see about Wagner fighters. I think the IRGC prescription is justified on the merits because there is absolutely no doubt that Iranian state organizations are involved extensively in spying and cybercrime, and it's very difficult to detect. And I think that proscription would make it much more difficult for people to operate in this country. But I do think that we have to be very careful about not overusing proscription. Sometimes it's better not to proscribe and to leave it to Dean and the other control authorities to deal with the people concerned.
I suppose you're
But there
drawing
are
out... Oh, sorry.
There are greater experts in the room than me. I mean, the current independent reviewer is over there and may have a view.
Would you like to give a view?
I think that people forget, thinking about the Wagner Group, the most capable terrorist organizations often have quite a degree of state control and sponsorship. And this is true of organizations like Hezbollah, which is sponsored and maybe even directed by Iran. So it's easy, I think, looking at the current crop of groups that have been prescribed to say, well, this is not really the pattern of group, and it opens the door to unfamiliar prescriptions. But I think if you take the longer view, it's consistent. And, you know, it's a nationalist ideology. It's a political ideology. It falls squarely within the definition of the Terrorism Act. I disagree with Alex on the IRGC, but just for the simple reason that it's part of the state. And ironically, it was an IRGC spokesman that announced that there had been a terrorist attack in Iran in the same way as Dean might talk about a terrorist attack in the UK. It's part of the state. That's not to excuse them. It may be that you need to find a different way of prescribing them because it could provide more tools for the authorities. But I would agree with you if your argument was about IRGC. The Wagner Group, I think, is entirely consistent with practice.
When I started working on counter-terrorism, international counter-terrorism, almost all of the groups we worked on were state-sponsored. So it was Al-Qaeda who really shifted that thinking away. But if you were talking about the 1980s and 90s, or 70s, 80s, they were almost all state-sponsored groups, actually.
I think there might be time for 2 more questions. Jordan's got a microphone, and then Matt's got a microphone.
Thank you, Catherine.
I'm Jordan. I'm one of the fellows this year. And I'd just like to say, before my question, Dean, Suzanne, Lord Carlile, thank you for your public service. Thank you for keeping us safe. I'm interested in the threat of cybercrime from terrorist groups affecting our critical infrastructure, especially that which is sponsored by regimes like Iran, as we've heard about. How do we tackle that from a public policy perspective? I know it's a bit different operationally, but what policies should we implement to directly tackle that? Thank you.
Yeah, cybercrimes are, again, a kind of complex area. So from an investigation point of view, it doesn't necessarily sit within kind of, my own remit. So we have other bodies and agencies out there. So we've got something called the NCSC, the National Cyber Security Centre. You've got GCHQ. You've then got another facility, part of GCHQ, linked to the Ministry of Defence that also looks at kind of cyber incidents. And then you've got the National Crime Agency as well. And I think part of the challenge you have with often kind of cyber attacks is a lot of those attacks are coming from overseas. Some of them state-sponsored, coming back to the issues around state-sponsored. Some of them, in the initial kind of attack, you've got no idea where they've come from and who's responsible. Are they state-sponsored or otherwise? And therefore it becomes a real challenge from an investigation point of view around, is it an act of terrorism? Is it organised crime? Is it ransomware? Is it something else? Quite often we see, particularly from countries like China, for instance, trying to, in essence, kind of steal a lot of our both government secrets and kind of secrets from kind of universities, not secrets, but material from universities and research. And that becomes a real challenge in, again, where does that actually sit? So it's a challenge from an investigation point of view. There's also a challenge around, come back to the National Cyber Security Centre, around actually the first steps are around prevention. How do you don't have to automatically default to an investigation. If you can prevent a cyber attack happening in the first place around securing systems, whether in fact it's in the private sector or government, there are simple steps that people can take at home, for instance, really simple steps, all the way up to kind of companies and government in relation to prevention. And again, you look at the National Cyber Security Centre in relation to that preventative advice. So they are the experts to ultimately identify cyber attacks and to try and prevent them. That's where you get your advice from. But investigations are really difficult for the reasons that I've mentioned.
Final question. You're getting on.
Hi, my name is Matthew. I'm also on the fellowship. And my question kind of pertains to what we were talking about before with the Anderson Review. And you, Susanna, spoke about how obviously a bit of more and less interest depending on the attacks that happen. But also, obviously, the Anderson Review was retrospective of the attacks and gave you those updates and what to change. And I was wondering if, following that, you think we're now in a place where if we do have a string of terrorist attacks, we won't have these massive amounts of updates because we are constantly reviewing our terrorism legislation, or if we are stuck in this kind of, due to the adapting nature of terrorism, that if there ever is a terrorist attack, we will always need to massively change or make a lot of changes to our way of countering terrorism.
Yeah, so I suppose if I start with that one. So the David Anderson Review, we probably did, slightly unusually, we did something different with that review. So what we used to do historically is an attack would happen and we'd wait an unnecessary amount of time, normally until there was some kind of coronial inquest or a public inquiry, before we did a kind of root and branch review such as that. And the reason I say unnecessary is because sometimes, therefore, you are years down the line before you actually conduct a review. So if I take Manchester, the Manchester Arena attack as an example, happened in 2017. And with the public inquiry that followed, you'll be well aware there were various volumes produced along the way with, how did the emergency response, what did that look like from a police, fire, ambulance perspective? How did the counter-terrorism kind of response go? And kind of other issues as well. So the latest volume that was produced, I think it was earlier on this year. So if you take from 2017 to earlier on this year, you're now talking 6 years down the line before, if you were going to wait like we used to do to get the public inquiry out of the way, you're 6 years down the line before you actually do a root and branch review. So coming back to what we did with David Anderson, what we decided to do is as we'd seen 5 attacks in that year, we were really concerned around, were they connected in any way? But the main concern was, could we have spotted, could we have prevented, could we have joined the dots better than we were? So that's why, coming back through government and David Anderson being employed in the way he was, rather than waste time and put kind of public safety at risk, let's understand where we could be better. And that then resulted in well over 100 recommendations. So some of those recommendations were around how we dealt with data, so kind of intelligence, and I'm not going to go into any great detail, but how we kind of process data, coming back to the kind of joining the dots analogy. Some of it was closer collaboration between the agencies, so that's the kind of CTOC debate that we've just had. Some of it was around multi-agency working, so rather than the kind of main agencies that I've spoken about, MI5, MI6, GCHQ and counter-terrorism policing, what about social services? What about mental health? What about the military, Ministry of Defence? What about local authorities? Because I think some of the danger we have within working in this space is everything becomes a secret. Everything becomes a secret or top secret. And we do become quite loath to share it beyond that initial community. So we don't often tell mental health services. We don't often tell social services. Whereas what David Anderson did, it actually said, yep, some of that you can share and you should share because they are support teams, they are support mechanisms that can help you, and therefore better multi-agency working. And then the kind of last fundamental kind of question that came out of David Anderson was that kind of extreme right-wing thing that, again, I explained earlier on. So MI5 taking primacy for extreme right-wing cases, which they never did before. So again, that changed fundamentally our casework. So that's where David Anderson, I suppose, for us was different, that we brought him in early. We exposed all of our systems and processes to him. We were really transparent because we wanted to learn, we wanted to be better, we wanted to join the dots better. And that then resulted in the 100+ recommendations. I think if it happened again, we'd do exactly the same. So, we'd bring in Lord Carlile or Jonathan Hall or somebody else to again, look at our systems and again, pose the kind of fundamental question, could we have been better? We'd do it again.
Can I make a logical intervention? So terrorists will surprise you. So logically, they're always going to find the way through your defences. So it's always going to be a shock when it happens. It's always going to expose something you hadn't thought of. And that's just kind of, it's not fair, I don't think, to then constantly be saying, oh, you guys should have known this, you should have known that. The point is that it's this constant sort of invention arms race with the terrorists, and you block one thing and they try another, and you block one thing, and sooner or later they're going to get through. So, sorry, Lord Carlile.
Can I just make a point about reviews? It's a broad point. If you take the Lucy Letby case, which is notorious and recent, there's been announced that Lady Justice Thirlwall is going to carry out the review into that case, and she'll do a very good job, I'm sure, but it will take a long time. But we do not have to wait until Lady Justice Thirlwall produces her report. It is surely part of the duty of care for all the health agencies involved, the regulators, the General Medical Council, the Nursing and Midwifery Council, the Health Authority in Chester, to get the work done as fast as possible to contribute to the Thirlwall inquiry, but to ensure that within weeks, never mind years, that kind of event could never occur again. Which brings me to the reviewing of terrorism in this country. There's only one other country that has something like the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, and that's Australia. The Australian Monitor, I think he's called still, of terrorism law operates on a slightly different basis, and I think because he has legal powers, it's actually made him very slightly less effective. Because the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, and I was the first from 9/11, the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation has the power to work very fast, to name and shame, which governments don't like, particularly the shaming bit, and to produce reports of his or her own motion on events that occur, and to produce the sort of excellent report that David Anderson, who succeeded me as independent reviewer, produced, which has been referred to. We don't have an independent reviewer of rape, we don't have an independent reviewer of burglary, we don't have actually a single independent reviewer of deaths in hospitals, but it works very well for terrorism, and I think it's actually a model of how these issues should be dealt with and should be looked at in other connections outside the criminal law.
Thank you. Are we out of time now? Okay, we're out of time now, guys. You've both been completely fantastic. Thank you very much for spending the time with us and giving us so much to think about. So a round of applause for Lord Carlile and Dean.